Good morning. I am excited and honored to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. David Rhew. Dr. Rhew is a physician, a healthcare researcher, a technologist, and is a global chief medical officer and VP of healthcare for Microsoft. He's an adjunct professor at Stanford University, holds 6 US patents, and has been recognized as one of the 50 most influential clinical executives by Modern Healthcare. You have a much more distinguished and lengthy introduction, but I think I'll hand it over to you, Dr. Rhew, and honored and pleased to have you on the Digital Summit stage.
Oh, thank you so much, Tarun. It's a real pleasure to be here. And one of the things that I wanted to share is that I've been thinking about healthcare technology for quite some time, and I'm very excited to share with you some of the things that I've observed, not only over the past several years, but also more recently, as we think about how these technologies can be used to improve the area of life sciences and med tech. What I wanted to focus on were some of the emerging trends, the challenges that we see, and also opportunities. These oftentimes present business opportunities and opportunities for us to start working together in ways that we haven't. And what I wanted to do is, if we could start up with the slides, is just to describe a little bit about what those initial trends are, and then move into perhaps a deeper discussion at the very end. So in terms of the slides, in terms of the major trends and opportunities, if we move on to the next slide, there's 4 that I wanted to highlight. And the first is around health equity. The second is around consumerism. The third around virtual care and artificial intelligence and machine learning. And the fourth around precision medicine. With regards to health equity, this is a topic that oftentimes we hear quite a bit about in the news. It is something that many organizations are investing time and resources to better understand, but also to address. Consumerism, a large part of that has stemmed from the fact that consumers are interested and now more engaged than ever related to their health. But at the same time, it creates some opportunities for us to think about how we can improve that experience and also transform some of the business models. Virtual care, I think during the pandemic, we've seen a significant push towards telehealth and remote monitoring. But what we're seeing also is an opportunity to be able to embed those technologies with artificial intelligence, machine learning, and be able to enhance the current experience. And lastly, when we talk about precision medicine, it's not just about genomics, but it really is about understanding individuals and where they are in their journey and how we can better help them. So let's jump right into it. If we move on to the next slide, I want to talk a bit about health equity. And really, the pandemic has highlighted several aspects of disparities in care that we see. First and foremost, as we started seeing the pandemic hit different populations, we saw higher mortality rates in underserved communities, in individuals that were older. And in those individuals, oftentimes, as we started thinking about ways that we could provide information and vaccinations to, those were the groups that we needed extra efforts to be able to reach and oftentimes provide communications around. But the challenges that we saw, everything from lack of broadband access to digital training, to now also starting to realize that vaccinations and a variety of other things are not reaching the people that are most vulnerable and underserved, required that we actually think beyond simply providing equal treatment to everybody, but think about how we can provide equitable, which means enabling everyone to have the same ability to achieve the outcomes that every one of us would like to have. So if we move on to the next slide, I want to talk about a model of care that we see in terms of how we can address health equity and some of the things that are quite different than what we currently do. So if we think of what we do today, a lot of it is based on clinic care and hospital care. And what we're talking about is having individuals come to facilities and buildings that we reside in, and then that's where the care will be delivered. And oftentimes it's where a procedure is performed, perhaps a surgery, there's a consultation, and then there's essentially a discussion around, we'll see you back in let's say 3 months or 6 months. That is having people come to where we're at. very convenient for a healthcare provider, very convenient for a hospital. We can consolidate all our resources. But the reality is when we start thinking about community care and we start thinking about how we address individuals with special needs, it has to be about meeting people where they're at, in the communities that they're in, allowing us to be able to understand that there are more factors that are important to them than simply getting their health. And that is getting food on their table, having income, having some ability for us to be able to address these, what we oftentimes refer to as social determinants or social influencers of health. And without these things that need to be addressed, we all will find ourselves that we are not able to deliver better care. It's hard for a person to let's say if they're a diabetic, to be able to take the insulin if they don't have a refrigerator, and they don't have a refrigerator if they don't have a home. So these are all factors that we oftentimes need to consider as we think about how we address these bigger and broader issues in underserved communities and for individuals who don't necessarily have all the necessities of care. And so as we've thought through this model, if we move on to the next slide, I want to give you an example of how we have taken the model of bringing together communities and understanding their needs and allowing us to be able to address and meet people where they're at. So within the context of vaccinations, perhaps one of the most challenging aspects has been around vaccine hesitancy. And as we all recognize, in hesitancy, the issues and challenges are multiple. Well, first and foremost, there are individuals that have very legitimate questions and concerns that need to be addressed. And in order for us to address them, we have to have trusted local leaders empowered with the knowledge to be able to deliver those information and messages. Now, once those individuals have the message, then we need to make it easier for them to be able to gain access to the vaccinations. And oftentimes what we found was that simply providing a site that was with the local wasn't good enough. It had to be available during working hours or during hours that they were off hours in which they were available. So what we oftentimes found is that there were multiple aspects in how we needed to engage people and then make this easier for them. And as we started these conversations, we needed to empower the local leaders with the information. And that meant understanding in the communities who were the ones who actually had the ear and were able to communicate to the individuals in the community. Oftentimes, these were church leaders, pastors, these were teachers, these were individuals who were strong community leaders. But what we found is that every one of them needed to have, in coordination, a healthcare provider and a public health support network. And to connect these dots, we realized that when we had these conversations, oftentimes what was necessary was that we could go beyond simply COVID vaccinations discussions, but we could talk about other things that were important to them, such as childhood immunizations for school, adult immunizations that were missed during the pandemic, screening for colon cancer, screening for blood pressure, a variety of other types of things. And as we've thought through social determinants, assessing whether or not people had insurance, enrolling them in insurance, providing them transportation, giving them services that around food, all of this was something that we realized was a potential opportunity. And so to pull this all together, a coalition of organizations, nonprofits, technology companies, healthcare organizations, public health, all got together and formed a coalition called the Vaccination Equity Initiative. And as part of that, the goal was to deliver vaccinations as well as essential health services to the underserved and in those in low access to care communities. And what we found was that in empowering these communities, we could not only provide the vaccinations, but deliver on a whole range of services. And it served as a bridge for us to be able to continue these conversations beyond that initial contact, and perhaps even start thinking about how we could deliver continued healthcare into these communities. This is an example of public-private partnerships in action, specifically focused on one area, but really building off of that to expand into multiple. Let's move on to the next slide. I want to talk a bit about a topic that ties directly into this, and it's about understanding the needs of the individuals and the expectations. And in the context of healthcare and even beyond healthcare, we talk about consumerism. And what you see in front of you are some examples of some consumer devices that oftentimes are associated with the consumerism. Taking a device that a person uses every day, could be a smartphone, could be a smartwatch, could be just even your telephone, but just what we realize is that individuals expect a certain delivery mechanism. The information needs to be presented to them that's understandable. It needs to be on forms that they are using every day. And in fact, it needs to be something that ties directly into a value or something that would be of importance to them. And what we realized is that empowering health consumers with information can lead to better health outcomes. We've seen this in many studies that the more activated an individual is, the better their health outcomes, the lower their readmission rates, the greater their engagement. And oftentimes what we find is the better the patient satisfaction. And to do that, what we've realized is we can't simply just provide data on these devices. In fact, it not only doesn't work for consumers, but it doesn't work for the vast majority of clinicians. Most clinicians that I know are unlikely to want to get a download of all the patient's steps or heart rate just to simply take a look at that and find some kind of an insight. There really has to be a process for understanding what all this information means, and then present it back to a clinician and or individual in the form of an actionable insight. If we move on to the next slide, I want to talk a bit more about how that can be done. And largely, the way that we have to think about this is that it has to be data that is interoperable. The data that's brought in has to be understood in the context of the individual, their medical record, and all the other pieces that we know that are being collected. And once all those different data sets are brought together and made understandable through interoperability standards such as fast healthcare interoperability resources or FHIR, now we have an ability to be able to start understanding how different sources of data can be put together to lead to those actionable insights. FHIR is a standard that I think many of you have heard of. It has now become an industry standard with the first 21st Century Cures Act initiating a push towards interoperability, and now with CMS interoperability rules being enacted, electronic health record vendors, the payers with their claims data sets have to enable this information to be made accessible to consumers. So this is really the next step of consumerization, because consumers are empowered to be able to pull data from their medical records, from the claims data sets onto the device of their choice or the technology of their choice, and allow them to be able to gain access to it. Now, the first use case that we oftentimes think about for that is an individual that would be interested in perhaps sharing that information with another doctor. Maybe they're admitted to another hospital or they're moving to another clinic and they would like to share that information. So it makes it a lot easier for them to be able to do so. And now with the blocking rules in place, it's something that hospitals and EHR vendors have to make easy. They cannot block this so that consumers cannot do that. But that's just the opportunity for us to start thinking beyond this. So let's just take a real world example today. What we are now looking at with the pandemic is a large number of individuals are starting to realize that they have to demonstrate or show verification of vaccinations or a negative test result in order to enter into a facility or travel. That is becoming a standard across many cities and states and countries. And as we think about that, what really is happening? It's part of your medical record that needs to be shared. So one of the key initiatives that is underway nationwide and globally is leveraging Smart on FHIR so that we can pull data using those same standards for electronic health records and allow us to be able to pull the vaccination records from state immunization registries from your electronic health record onto your smartphone and into the device and cloud or into your technology of choice. And that is allowing us to be able to further the cause of consumerism, where more and more individuals will be empowered with their own medical information. If we go into the next slide, I want to talk a bit more about what they can do with that information, because a lot of that information ultimately needs to be acted on. It's not just about giving access to somebody to be able to transfer it, but a lot of that can be used to help understand if you are potentially eligible for certain programs, or if you're someone who needs to be seen more urgently. And one of the things that we have seen during the pandemic is that the use of AI-based chatbots can be extraordinarily helpful. And in fact, what we also observed initially during the pandemic was that many individuals had questions. Do I have COVID? Should I see the doctor? That was something that, because there were so many individuals asking the same question, they were inundating call centers, and they were actually coming into the urgent care, and in many cases exposing themselves to individuals who did have COVID. And so the primary function of the chatbot initially was to help provide information, the right information at the right time, to large number of consumers that all had similar questions, but were individualized. Everyone had a slightly different story. It wasn't all the same story. It was some variation. Maybe some had symptoms, maybe some had exposures, maybe some were just concerned. And in all the cases, using a CDC guideline, we were able to deploy the use of chatbots that allowed us to be able to decrease the amount of inflow into these urgent care centers and allow people to feel comfortable in staying at home, or perhaps even connecting them virtually to an individual clinician as part of a virtual care visit. But the same chatbot technology was also used to enroll people into clinical trials. It actually did assessments. It would take a look at the information that was presented and perhaps ask a few more questions, and then identify that you were actually eligible for a clinical trial. Now, this was a really interesting insight because it gave us the opportunity to understand how these AI-based chatbots, when presented at the right time, can enable us to be able to bring and do screening for individuals at a large scale, and then connect them to not only healthcare providers, but to clinical trials, to services such as plasma donation, and also determine eligibility for certain programs such as for SDOH. So we move on to the next slide. I want to talk a bit more about how this is all being operationalized. A lot of times this is all being done virtually. In terms of virtual, we oftentimes think of virtual care as telehealth, which is what we're doing to some degree here, where we've got a video visit or a video consultation or a video discussion. But there's much more to telehealth than that. And there really is the opportunity when we start thinking about how healthcare data can be brought into these environments, specifically using FHIR. We now have an opportunity to collaborate in ways that we haven't collaborated before. Because a lot of times the conversation is about a piece of your medical record. We talked about vaccinations and lab results, but it could be about an X-ray. It could be about an MRI scan. It could be about an EKG. There's a lot of information that's in the medical record that we oftentimes are making reference to that we would like to surface up during the course of the consultation. Additionally, as we think about clinicians talking to other clinicians, these are clinicians that oftentimes need to have a sharing of that information through a HIPAA compliant manner. Now with FHIR standards now being integrated into virtual care, we have an ability to showcase all of that information. And one of the things that this is also presented is the opportunity for that information to be brought in and analyzed using AI. So I'd like to share with you an example of how right now we are seeing in a virtual care setting, artificial intelligence being applied to information data sets and providing the right information at the right time to make better decisions. Let's move on to the next slide. And in this example, we're going to talk about the concept of a virtual tumor board. And as most of you know, individuals with cancer oftentimes need a multidisciplinary discussion around what's best for them. It's about the type of treatments, the genomics of the cancer. It's about understanding the expectations of the patient, but also the medical literature and all the different pieces that we know today, identifying which treatments are most effective. With AI, we can understand that and be able to act on that information real time. So let's take a look at the video.
We're all touched by cancer in one way or another. Every cancer is different. Tumors can have hundreds and thousands of cell mutations. How do we find that one change that we can target and treat that cancer?
There's millions of scientific articles covering specific mutations and combinations with drugs.
We can't possibly keep up with all that literature.
The clinical knowledge base is an innovative technology where all those variants, mutations that exist in cancer are being curated as they're discovered by researchers around the world.
That's where our collaboration comes in with Microsoft AI to help us triage the literature Machine-assisted human curation can assist going through all of those publications and saying, this is one, so that the team can use their scientific expertise to interpret them.
It's a life or death situation. It's also a question of how you accelerate certain discoveries and bring them into clinical practice. We have a stage 4 esophageal cancer patient who's 60 years old.
We can more accurately predict patient responses to a combination of targeted therapies, immunotherapies, and even drug resistance. It is that funnel to be able to get to the right mutation with the right treatments associated.
With Microsoft AI, oncologists will be able to improve patient outcomes.
Every morning I wake up to fight cancer. Through the collaboration with the Jackson Laboratory and Microsoft AI, we can know that we haven't missed anything. And it's just been wonderful.
So that's one example of how we can start looking at how AI can be applied within a virtual care setting. We move on to the next slide. I want to talk
We're
about
all touched by cancer in one way or another.
Oops, have to slide on. Okay. One of the things that we have seen also is in the course of a conversation that the information that's being captured oftentimes can serve as a medium for us to be able to make things easier if it was automated. What we have also found is that the burden of entering orders into an electronic health record system, or I should say entering documentation in, can be quite time consuming. And what we are finding now is something called ambient clinical intelligence can be helpful in the process of taking that information, that conversation, converting it from voice to text, understanding contextually what it is, mapping it to certain terms, organizing it to clinical progress notes, and then integrating it directly into medical records. All of this can be done with literally in a matter of seconds. And what we are now finding is that this can be integrated into clinical discussions. So as an individual is having a discussion with the patient, it could be a clinician, it could be a researcher, somebody who is providing a set of standardized questions. That information can be captured and seamlessly brought into the medical record. Let me show you an example of how this technology is working today.
You don't become a doctor to bill. You become a doctor to take care of patients. You become a doctor to serve humanity. Ambient intelligence allows for the patient and doctor to be a patient and a doctor, like it used to be.
There's a certain business requirement for a structured note and careful documentation, precise diagnoses, and carefully backed up coding for the business practice of medicine. But ultimately, it's about the patient's story.
If you look at the promise of meaningful use and all the reasons we got into a digital health record, it really was to take better care of the patient. Unfortunately, sometimes we've done that through a barrier, meaning we added a keyboard, we added a computer, and I think that's a key part of why physicians are frustrated.
And I mean, you notice as a patient, you notice that your physician is typing and talking and, you know, yeah, okay, yeah.
Now we can go into the background and just capture all the information you needed, but also maybe more importantly, capture something that was missed. That missed was the patient's story.
There's a device on the wall, and it's listening to your conversation, and it's able to discriminate between a patient and a physician and a family member, and is able to generate a progress note and a patient encounter based on your conversation.
What it has enabled is that I can pay attention to what you are saying, because it is very important for me to have the empathy and you to feel as a patient that you are telling somebody who actually cares about you.
Hey, Dragon, start my standard order set for arthritis pain.
The idea of a computer that can listen like in Star Trek and just hear what's going on and make sense of it and slip into the background and listen, but only interject when necessary, that was for a long time a fantasy.
I would say before, in a typical week, I would probably spend 6 to 8 hours documenting, just simply dictating and signing notes. I bet that my time has been cut into half, if not thirds, because of nuance now.
It takes the hands-on time that the provider has to spend with the computer and puts that time back with the patient.
It really takes a lot of that manual work out of the patient encounter and just allows it to happen kind of naturally.
Ambient puts a listening device in the room quietly, securely, privately, and allows the two people in the room to really have a very intimate discussion on very private things. Knowing that the necessary recording of that for the business of medicine and healthcare can go on in the background, but letting that personal connection continue. And that's the reason I think almost all of us went into healthcare. It's to be able to be there for people, to express caring, to express empathy, and to connect as human beings.
So with ambient clinical intelligence, this can also be integrated into the virtual care environment. In fact, it is. So a lot of times the virtual care visits that are being done can be captured, the entire conversation, not just voice to text, but understood, and then converted into a progress note, then integrated into the medical record. Now, there's a lot of advantages to that, above and beyond the fact that it saves time to enter orders in, or it enters documentation into the EHR. One is that the computer actually understands what you're talking about. So we can apply decision support rules on top of this and look and screen individuals for eligibility for clinical trials. We can look to see whether or not these are individuals that potentially would be optimal could receive optimal treatments. And this is an opportunity for us to really start looking at ways that we can apply decision support in ways that we haven't. So this is the second area. We're going to talk about a third area of how AI could be applied within a virtual care setting. And this is one that focuses on the use of a mixed reality. So rather than me trying to explain a little bit more about what this is, let's run the video and I think you'll get a sense of what and how this works.
Today, HoloLens 2 is transforming our daily practice in surgery. It meets two objectives: ensuring maximum safety of the surgical procedure and optimizing the quality of the patient care. For example, I can communicate with other colleagues such as radiologists, infectious disease specialists to get their opinion during the surgery. And it is well known that this multidisciplinarity considerably improves patient management. The great strength of this application for HoloLens 2 is also, and above all, to provide surgical guidance. From the patient's CT scan, a 3D model of the skeleton is reconstructed and integrated into an application. HoloLens 2 and this application automatically calibrate the skeleton hologram on the real patient. The areas hidden by the skin then become visible. And it is possible, for instance, to define the perfect axis of the pin to be introduced into the patient's skeleton. It's like having augmented eyes, allowing the gesture to be even more precise. The scrub nurse also benefits from this application, which details each step of the surgery and the associated instruments. Easy access to this procedure reassures the scrub nurse and makes he or she much more efficient. The goal is also to collect all the data from the surgery, but also from the surgeon during all these surgeries, for processing all this data in an artificial intelligence center located at Sorbonne University Paris Nord. The ultimate goal is to model the perfect surgical gesture. HoloLens 2 offers a fantastic field of possibilities that currently transform our practice every single day.
So 3 great examples of how AI can be brought into virtual care. Let's move on to the next slide. I wanted to talk a bit more about the concept of how all this information can then enable us to be able to start thinking about how to virtualize clinical trials to make this process more seamless. And as we think through, there are multiple different stages. Each one of them could have a virtual element in which virtual tools, artificial intelligence can be used to help us better understand how to streamline all this. And this is something that if many of you are already involved, I'm sure, in these decentralized clinical trials, but we're going to continue to see greater innovations in ways that this can lead to more efficient and effective clinical trial management. Let's move on to the next slide. I want to talk a bit more about remote monitoring, another aspect of virtual care. And as we think about remote monitoring, we oftentimes think about all the different components. These are all things that today we can measure through different sensors, whether they're wearables or patches, or even things that are implanted within one's body. These class 2, class 3 devices can provide some significant amount of information. If we move on to the next slide, I want to talk a bit about where we're at today and where we're heading. So today, a large part of what we do is we look at each one of these parameters and we will assign an upper bound, a lower bound, and in which case perhaps there's an alert that will be signaled if an individual exceeds or goes below a certain threshold. Now that is something that actually doesn't correlate very well with clinical behavior, because a lot of times I am, as a clinician, not too interested in any one particular parameter, but I'm more interested in understanding how all of this fits together to be able to determine, is this individual actually getting better or getting worse? Do I need to act earlier? Do I need to change my behavior, change the treatment plan, or do I continue on that? That's really what we're looking for. And the assumption is that each one of these parameters will tell us. The reality is that it is the combination. If we move on to the next slide, to do that, we really have to start thinking about how the information that we know from the medical literature, from our data sets, informs us about what are the key risk factors. And then from those risk factors, how do we weight each one accordingly, create algorithms or prediction rules that can allow us to be able to more accurately predict whether individuals are actually worsening or not. So my background, I'm in infectious disease doc. I've spent the early part of my career studying whether or not patients with community-acquired pneumonia can be safely admitted to the hospital, or I should say safely treated at home, need to be admitted to the hospital, how long they need to be in the hospital, and if they can be safely switched from IV to oral antibiotics and discharged home. Now, to do that, we had to look at the medical literature to understand what were the risk factors for community-acquired pneumonia, 30-day mortality. It turns out that while there are many factors, some are much more important than others. In fact, age is the most significant risk factor in terms of 30-day mortality for community-acquired pneumonia. Now, in terms of comorbidities, a lot of comorbidities out there, but it turns out that in terms of what we're looking at from a large population basis, there's only 5 that really matter. And in terms of physical exams and lab findings, again, just a smaller subset. And as we put these algorithms together, we can create prediction rules that can be validated in larger cohorts. But ultimately, if we move on to the next slide, what we have to do is we have to take all this information and boil it down into one number. This is a quote from one of my favorite movies called Moneyball. I'm not sure if you've seen it, but it's about really trying to understand which baseball players can, and how to put the baseball team out there. And what they started focusing on was not all the different parameters, but they needed to synthesize this down into getting into this one number. And as we think through that, if you move on to the next slide, in healthcare, bringing it down to one number allows us to be able to then organize individuals and then understand whether or not those individuals are different or similar to you or the patients that you're interested in. So now imagine I'm now interested in patients of a certain age, comorbidity, certain risk factors, and looking across that spectrum, if we move on to the next slide, are you actually heading in the right direction, or are you deviating off of that, or are you heading in the wrong direction? That's what we're interested in. We're interested in not knowing where you're at right now, but where you're going to be in the next 3 days, 5 days, a week. That's the type of trajectory that we're interested in. That only can be captured through data and artificial intelligence and allowing us to be able to understand at a larger level, more granular level, individuals like you. Let's move on to the next slide. And this gets into a whole process of how this can be done through the use of devices. And we talked about patches and wearables, but this is a somewhat complicated slide. It actually comes directly from the FDA guidance on AI and machine learning in software as a medical device. But let me walk you through at a very high level. Let's focus on the circles, the blue circles. So the first blue circle highlights the fact that in most cases, there's still a need to understand who's building the AI and who's actually building the devices themselves. And this ties into what we refer to as good machine learning practices, because what we are essentially doing is we are validating or verifying that you have a process such that these are built reliably and with consistency, and that you're meeting the key standards, whether it's ISO 9000, HIPAA, et cetera. Second and third part relate to the algorithm assessment, assessing whether or not it was developed in a way that looks and sounds and has been validated in populations that essentially justifies that this works well. But where we have oftentimes found is that we don't know if it works well in a real world until it is actually launched. And so this ties into the fourth one, which is performance monitoring of the actual algorithm to determine, is it actually doing what it was designed to do? And if not, let's bring it back and then adjust those algorithms accordingly. Oftentimes we find is that as we expand to broader populations, that we find that the differences in how they respond will need some kind of either adjustment or a variation in terms of how the algorithm is deployed. Let's move on to the next slide. So what we are now looking at is an opportunity for us to start thinking more precisely about individuals and thinking about ways that they become much more specific in our approach. Let's run this slide. Let's run this video. It's a quick video in terms of our approach working with one of our key customers on precision med.
Johns Hopkins is a world-renowned institution, well-respected for its commitment to education, research, and patient care.
Any large-scale, long-term digital transformation requires a very strong foundation. We've made considerable investments in cloud technologies, building a big data platform, and emphasizing security. We've empowered our employees with the best tools and have focused on ensuring our facilities and equipment are cutting edge. On top of this, we've built an innovation center staffed with talented engineers who are well-versed in delivering and scaling technological innovations into a care setting. And our applied physics laboratories working collaboratively with our government to leverage our digital solutions and apply them to national healthcare initiatives.
Each disease is comprised of subgroups. Patients in one subgroup behave differently to patients in another, and understanding how to deal with the patient best requires that you identify which subgroup the patient belongs to. Precision medicine for us is discovering patient subgroups at scale using revolutionary tools of measurement, computation, and connectivity to define those patients who are most homogeneous and therefore likely will have the same response to treatment.
While we've applied these concepts to 6 diseases, the beauty of this precision medicine program is the opportunity to scale. We're expanding rapidly and transforming all of Johns Hopkins medicine into precision medicine.
We believe that much like individualized health, we need to spend time focusing on individualized education. And so we have launched a precision education initiative to teach students just in time and just for me. It makes such a difference. Our relationship with Microsoft is much more than just technology. It's about really smart people working together to make a difference in the world.
So one of the key points is that we're now looking at an opportunity to understand individuals and finding individuals just like you, similar to what we talked about before. But the only way to do that is the data has to be collected, it has to be organized, it has to be made interoperable. It is something that now we are starting to build these larger data sets that can allow us to be able to make those inferences. Let's move on to the next slide. What we are recognizing is that to do this, to accomplish this goal that we had just talked about, it's going to require 3 elements. And if you think about, and I'm going to use an example that's probably not apropos for healthcare, but let's imagine this is a pizza. And you've got it divided into three big slices. In the upper left-hand side, we are talking about understanding the individual. That means understanding the different data sources that need to come in, making that something that we can pull in as much as possible so we understand not only what more about them, but where they are on their journey. Second, if we go to the lower part, it's about applying the AI and machine learning on top of that. And then as we think through that, it has to be acted upon. And that's the decision support. So that's the upper right-hand side. It's those 3 pieces, the data, the insights, and the action that allow us to be able to then provide a model for precision medicine. Let's move on to the next slide. If we think through this, then the different data sets on the left-hand side, electronic health record data sets, imaging data sets, genomics, proteomics, and a whole series of omics, third-party data such as social determinants, we talked about that earlier in the discussion, Internet of Medical Things, all the different devices that we come in, all of this comes in. This defines the individual, but it has to be made interoperable. It has to be brought into a common platform. And then all the tools that we talked about with the AI, I shared with you several examples, can be applied upon this so we can become much more proactive. And then it needs to be operationalized and pushed out into different tools that enable collaboration and coordination of care. Let's move on to the next slide. I want to share with you an example of like how this precision medicine is actually taking shape and the things that we are also seeing as opportunities. As many of you are well aware, with CAR T therapies and other types of cell and gene therapies, with very specific types of drugs that need to be developed, it requires a brand new supply chain. Data needs to be carried across the board to the manufacturers so that they know what type of individual treatment needs to be built. And then that information has to be brought to the right person at the right time. You cannot have a glitch in this process. It has to work seamlessly and it has to work at scale. And now what we're realizing is that the supply chains also need to be built with precision medicine in mind. Let's move on to this is my last slide here. I wanted to summarize what I've just talked about. I've talked about trends, health equity, consumerism, virtual care being embedded with artificial intelligence and machine learning and precision medicine. But with each one of these trends, there is an opportunity for us to apply technology to advance the causes. Within health equity, we're seeing collaborations, public-private partnerships take hold, where we can now build together models of care that allow for community-based care. With consumerism, we are now enabling consumers to be able to gain access to the medical records through FHIR interoperability. That gives them an opportunity to be able to identify in a more automated ways whether they're eligible for certain programs such as clinical trials, and allowing us to be able to then perhaps have a seamless virtual care visit. With virtual care, we can then add on top of that AI and machine learning. This allows us to open up new possibilities of virtual care tumor boards, mixed reality, and allowing us to be able to conduct clinical trials in a decentralized manner. And then with remote patient monitoring becoming much more proactive through predictive analytics. And lastly, around precision medicine, about understanding who you are, where you are on the journey. It allows us to be able to start thinking about how can we build treatments and drugs that are more specific for individuals, and then understanding those implications across the board, including supply chain. So with that said, I will pause and see if there's any thoughts or questions. Thank you very much for your time.
Great, thank you, Dr. Rhew. That was really just a fantastic presentation and really give a lot to think about. And I was particularly impressed to see the real-world applications of these, in some cases, even the Star Trek-like technologies that you had shown. That was really amazing. Right. So we do have some questions that are coming in. So let me just start to work through those and see what we can get in within the time we have left. First question. 2 out of 3 life sciences companies said they haven't achieved the results expected of their cloud initiatives to date. What could be some of the key reasons for it, and what can life sciences companies do to leverage cloud technology?
Well, I think part of it is the fact that cloud technology has evolved over time. I think in many cases, it was just about storage and compute. And there's a lot of value in terms of being able to do large amounts of computation at speed, at scale, and then being able to provide a secure environment to do that. So that there's immediate value in terms of how cloud can be applied. But what I shared with you were capabilities that are built on cloud that allow us to be able to basically do artificial intelligence, virtual care, collaboration. That is the real opportunity where the value of cloud goes beyond the storage and compute and allows us to be able to take full advantage of the fact that in order for us to achieve those goals, it needs multiple different data sources to come in, normalize, artificial intelligence to be applied upon that, and then it has to be collaborated. And one environment that allows us to be able to do all of that is the cloud.
Great. Thank you. Data sets are inherently biased and affect the outcomes of AI ML engines. What can be done to overcome these biases? Or how does one ensure a data set which is free of any bias?
Well, I think first and foremost, transparency. We have to be transparent in terms of what data we're collecting, who's who's involved. We could start with patient demographics, age, gender, and race. And maybe that's a starting point. But what we will realize is that the more transparent that we are, the ability for us to be able to then measure those outcomes after they're deployed allows us to be able to then come back and be able to adjust. Now, in some cases, the adjustments are so significant that what we will have to do is we'll have to say, hey, listen, we didn't account for this population in the original design. Now that we have looked at a broader population, we need a different algorithm, and that is something that will need to be included. We shouldn't be thinking of AI algorithms and these initial data sets as a one-time effort. It is an ongoing journey. It is something that allows us to be able to start with something, build off of it, learn from it, and continue to adjust.
Right. From a regulatory standpoint, what are some of the key measures that companies should take while adopting AI/ML initiatives?
I think one of the first is that as we recognize data security, privacy, transparency, all incredibly important. There's like table stakes. So as you think about where data gets stored, how it's managed, is it monetized? Is it, all the factors that people care about. It's very important to have a very clear strategy and understanding of where that data will reside and how you will build on that. Now, the FDA is actually very open to working with industry to try to figure out ways to move forward in some of these really challenging topics. Software as a medical device, AI as a software as a medical device. All of that, the FDA has made some very strong efforts with their pre-cert programs, with their ability to start looking at different types of white papers that they're putting out, oftentimes done in collaboration with industry leaders. So engaging the FDA early in your discussions, talking to them about what the programs that you're looking to develop, and also the challenges that you may see. Partnering also. I think a large amount of time, people are just reinventing the wheel. They are trying to do something to get, to meet all the requirements, but it's very difficult, especially if you are a smaller company or a smaller organization that doesn't have necessarily all the capabilities on the technology side. It's hard to keep up on this. And if you start thinking about moving globally, boy, you've got to deal with all these multiple different countries and regions and their regulations. Partnership with organizations that have already built the infrastructure to be able to handle all of that, whether it be around data interoperability and FHIR, meeting compliance standards. It's something that is a very worthwhile investment for most organizations.
And the next question, actually, I think it dovetails off the first one. I guess a lot of interest in cloud providers, but what should be the key parameters to evaluate while choosing a cloud service provider?
Well, I'd say let's start with, whether or not you feel that this cloud provider meets your needs. I think there's obviously a lot of different flavors out there. One of the things that we've done at Microsoft, which we feel pretty strong about, is we don't monetize the data. Our goal is simply to empower. I think that's aligned well with most organizations. They are, interested more in terms of making sure that they align with the partner that will empower them, protect the data, provide capabilities that they might be able to leverage as they continue to build their tech stack. And that's something that, I think is important. But, as you think through this, there are a variety of different opportunities for us to be able to go beyond storage and compute. And I think that's something that, it's very important that you look at. If it's just storage and compute, that's a very limited value proposition. But if it's storage and compute plus capabilities that allow you to become much more relevant within the healthcare space, that integrate into multiple different systems, that allow you to be able to meet compliance standards, that's a far better value prop.
Yeah, exactly. And I think today, even with the cloud providers, companies like Microsoft and some other large players are actually providing a platform, especially for the AI and ML initiatives. Is there actually a platform in which you can build your business applications? It's not just the compute power, it's actual implementable algorithms and processes and applications that you can actually build off of. So that's right. Also something we look at that with service providers. I think we can squeeze in one last question. Who were the early adopters of AI in life sciences, and what has success looked like for them?
Well, I'll tell you from our perspective, because we've been working with Novartis. They were one of the very first partners that we made a very public announcement around. And, it takes a lot of vision for us to be able to make these announcements, because the companies are not looking for a project in which they just want to put the data into the cloud. They're looking to transform their business. They want to be competitive in the next 5, 10, 20 years, and beyond. That means that they are thinking about how cloud and all its capabilities will enable them to become much more efficient and productive in everything from R&D to supply chain to consumer engagement. And what we have realized is that now a large number of those big companies are shifting towards the cloud because of the fact that it does provide a tremendous amount of opportunity. And at the same time, the timing is right, because a large part of the cloud vendors have started thinking about beyond storage and compute. What else can they do? And this information, that needs to be gathered and captured has to be collaborated upon. We are seeing a large number of collaborations occur, data sharing. This is something that's very important. So they're starting to realize that as we start thinking about these emerging trends and opportunities, we need to work with partners that are also building capabilities that allow us to be able to take advantage of what we know is going to be an important industry trend and or something that we would like to be involved in. So I'd just like to share some final thoughts. First of all, thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure and an honor to speak to you. There are so many important emerging trends that we see in healthcare and in life sciences today. But what we recognize is that technology, cloud, AI can enable us to be able to take advantage of the fact that we have newer opportunities to be able to address things that were never possible before. I've shared with you several examples of how these are possible, but I'd encourage you to continue to explore both within your organization and outside, how that we may be able to leverage some of these newer technologies. Innovation is going to be a big part of how our business and how healthcare continues to grow, and in life sciences, it will become the lifeline for most organizations. So as we continue to think about that, technology will be the enabler. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to seeing you around sometime soon. Thank you.